Today I'm going to be making a leather bowl. I've drawn and 3D printed a template, which I will affix to a piece of 8 to 9 ounce vegetable tanned leather with a pair of pins and trace it out with a third. An ounce in this context actually refers to a 64th of an inch of thickness, so this leather is about an eighth of an inch thick. Presumably 1 square foot of 1 ounce thick leather should also have a weight of about 1 ounce, but the measurement has been standardized to refer to the thickness alone. The smaller round holes here are just to reduce the amount of material in the template. Just to keep this project a bit more accessible, I'm going to briefly show you how to generate this template on paper. Starting with a compass set to a 6-inch radius, I'll make a generously long arc, then set the compass on that arc and connect it to its own center. Use that vertex as the center for a third arc to form a rouleau triangle. A triangle of 5 3/4 inch radius is then made using the original vertices. I find the center of the triangle by marking 3 inches and 15/32 from each corner. Then draw a circle with a 1-inch radius. Mark a point 1 5/8 of an inch from the center, in line with each corner. And mark a point on the inner triangle 1/4 inch either side of that line. And connect those points to the outer perimeter to mark the darts that will be removed later. Those angles are rounded off with a 3/16 inch fillet. Then I find a convenient length for the stitching line. In this case, my stitching iron is about 1 5/16 long, so I make a line parallel to the edge of each dart, extending from the center of each fillet. The inner triangle is marked 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the darts, and that's all set. If you laminate this pattern, you can trace it out on slightly damp leather to ensure the marks show up clearly and still reuse it. In my case, though, I'll stick to the plastic template. Next, I'll cut out the overall shape. And carefully cut a wedge out of each corner. These will be closed up later to form the bowl shape. I find it difficult to do detailed work with a box cutter, so I'll trim everything reasonably close to the lines with a chisel to get something looking like this. Then I'll punch out stitching holes on either side. To find the center, I'll make 3 very light marks with a pair of dividers set to the radius of the circle, and with one leg placed on roughly equidistant parts of the perimeter. This isn't strictly necessary, I just wanted a guide in this case for drawing a flower design. Which I will outline lightly with a pencil. A really heavy pencil mark might show up on the finished item. I'll wet the leather with water to soften it in preparation for cutting and stamping. I usually go over the surface about 3 times with a foam brush, then let it sit for a minute or so until the color evens out. If the leather is too dry, it won't pick up a lot of detail from the stamps, and if it's too wet, the stamp might push the leather around it back up, and the leather itself will stretch due to insufficient support from the back surface. I'll cut the remaining features I had originally marked out with a swivel knife, and then move on to the flower. I'll go around the inside of that outer border with a smooth beveler. Then the inside of the central circle with a textured beveler, so it will appear to sit in the background relative to the flower. A light pass here will separate the higher petals from the lower petals. Angling the stamp backwards, away from the texture it's creating, will shorten the bevel so it looks like the petals are close together, while still leaving them with some thickness, and a heavier pass will separate them all from the background. The center will be set back with a flower center. Similar stamps seem to be referred to as cedars. I guess it's mostly a question of how large your particular design is relative to the tool. I'll create a channel along each petal with a smooth background tool. Then fill in that circle with a sort of random texture. And I'll add some little wrinkles to the petals with the swivel knife. The border will get an alternating pattern of smaller mule foot and larger camouflage stamps. The backing will be made of 3 to 4 ounce leather. You could use 2 layers of 6 to 7 or anything near that. I don't use that very often, so I've got more of the 8 to 9 and 3 to 4 lying around. Cutting the backing a bit oversized will give some room for error when they get cemented together. For which purpose I'll spread some barge all-purpose cement over both surfaces, being careful to ensure adequate ventilation and not to get any on the outside faces, because the dye will not penetrate it properly. I'll press the leather together, then hammer down the backside to make sure the entire surface is bonded securely and the glue line is as thin as possible. Then trim the edges and sand them with 80 and 120 grit sandpaper. Now would also be a great time to transfer the stitching holes through to the backside, so make a note of that, but I forgot. I'll bevel the edges with a bent nail as opposed to a proper beveler, because it's worked well enough, I guess, for several years. Definitely on the short list of tools which need replacing, though. Everything but the inner circle will be thoroughly dyed to give a nice dark green. I'm not too worried about streaking because I'm using so much, or about getting inside that circle a little bit because that's going to be black. I'll use a brush for the details, but still applying dye rather than paint, because it's much easier to get a saturated color, it dries quickly, and it matches the texture of the rest of the leather. Paint would make sense for lighter colors like yellow and especially white, where the natural leather color needs to be covered up. I don't want to get too much dye on the brush, however, because it will flow out and wet an area somewhat larger than the tip of the brush. You might also see that lifting the brush leaves behind a drop of dye, so make sure to pull away from an edge before doing that, or it might creep over into an adjacent color. Once that's dried, the whole thing gets a heavy smear of antique finish, which in this case is Fiebing's dark brown. It's a sort of nasty crap that partially fills in the surface texture to add a sense of depth. Just work it into all of the grooves to press out any bubbles. Then immediately wipe off the excess with a clean cloth, but just the excess. I'll be stitching it together with white thread, so I'll want to make sure the stitching holes are relatively clean so they don't stain the thread. Now I remembered to transfer the stitching holes through to the back. The stitching iron tends to blow out the far side, so I'll lightly punch it through the other way. Then blend the edges back in with the same cloth I used to clean up the antique. Some gum tragacanth on the edges and a brisk burnishing with a spent cartridge case will smooth down the rough fibers. and once everything is dry, it all gets a couple of coats of Fiebing's Resolene, which gives some degree of water resistance to the antique. The Resolene itself, however, has water in it, and the instructions recommend applying it with a damp cloth. Some people dilute it in water by about 50%, and this seems to allow it to absorb a bit better rather than just forming a film on top of the leather, and maybe reduces the bubbles a bit. In either case, it's very easy to wipe away all of that antique, so dabbing it or very lightly brushing it with a saturated cloth seems to be the way to go. Those bubbles will leave visible rings if the finish dries around them, so keep moving them around or poke them with the edge of the cloth. In this case, I guess I'm going to get rid of them with a dry cloth right away, which I'll later use to buff the surface. You can see it has kind of a matte appearance as applied. And there it is after buffing. The last thing to do is stitch the corners together, so I'll cut off a couple of feet of thread, which in this case is 1mm flat waxed thread, which adds friction to keep the stitches together and keeps the ends tight so they're easy to pass through the eye of a needle. The needle then gets passed through the thread, which locks everything together so they don't separate when I pull them through the leather. This won't show up exceptionally well on camera, but I've got a needle on each end of the thread, and they go through the outermost holes from front to back. Then the slack is pulled out evenly on each side. From your perspective now, the right side thread goes through the outermost hole on the left from back to front, and it's inserted on the inside of the hole closer to the center of the bowl. I'll pass the left side needle through the right side hole in the same way, and the threads will cross over. Moving to the front again, the right side thread goes through the next hole on the left side, and the left side thread crosses over it. This same pattern will be repeated all the way down, but after a couple of stitches are in place I can pull it tight and it should hold, which is why I find it easier to go from outside to inside, and the knot at the end won't be under tension, so if it were to fail for some reason, the leather won't come apart. Once the last stitch is done, I'll tie a little knot directly over one of the holes if I can, then pass one needle through the hole and pull everything tight. If I can't get it quite right, as is the case here, I'll pass both needles through and pull the knot into the hole, which leaves a loose bit of thread on the back. I'll have to pass the needle through to the front again and pull everything tight. In the end, the knot is hidden inside the hole where nobody's going to bother it. Then I can cut the threads and stuff the ends inside the holes with the back of a needle. And there it is, a bowl for stuff.